we really simply turn now to our speaker, and the title of the talk is the Sultan's Eunuch, the Chief Harem Eunuch, is Shaper of the Ottoman Empire. And so thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, David and Craig, for this gracious invitation. And I have to say, David, if you've been following my work since the 1980s, that's since I was a graduate student. So that's extremely flattering. And my condolences, because certainly back then, my work was extremely unformed. In any case, today's talk is related to a book that I published 3 years ago called, as you see, The Chief Eunuch of the Ottoman Harem, From African Slave to Power Broker, which is a study of the office of Chief Harem Eunuch, really from beginning to end. So that's from the late 16th century until the end of the Ottoman Empire in the early 20th century. What I'm going to do today is not simply a plug for the book, and it's not simply a summary of the book, although it may seem like that to some people. I'm going to go through this list of topics more or less chronologically, and my strategy is for each major topic to use one particular Chief Harem Eunuch as a prime example of this phenomenon. So first off, a bit of background on, before we get to the Ottoman Empire, specifically the role of eunuchs in world history, and then why African eunuchs were so heavily used as harem guardians in virtually all Islamic empires, as well as others. And then zeroing in on the Ottoman Empire itself, the creation of the office of Chief Harem Eunuch in the 1580s, the transformative society-wide crisis of the 17th century, the Chief Eunuch's connections to Mecca and Medina, the Muslim holy cities, which were key to his office and identity, his role in building economic infrastructure throughout the empire, his influence on Ottoman religious and intellectual life, and then bringing the story to a close, the denouement of the Chief Harem Eunuch institution in the 19th century, particularly with the coming of Europeanizing reforms, and then what happened to the Chief Harem Eunuch with the end of the Ottoman Empire. And if I have time after all that, you know, speaking of the very end of everything, how Chief Harem Eunuchs are memorialized in grave tombstones. So I'm trying to get my presentation to advance, but it's not really cooperating. Let me try. Actually, the screen is pretty much frozen, which has happened to me before, but it's still extremely annoying. Okay, there we go. All right. As you see from this pastiche slide, eunuchs are an element of a wide variety of civilizations, at least in the old world, going back almost all the way to the beginnings of human civilizations, so far as we know, and maybe all the way to the earliest human civilizations. I'm not going to dwell on this slide in detail, but the earliest known use is in the so-called Neo-Assyrian Empire, which goes back to the 10th century BCE. Eunuchs are also used in the ancient Persian Empire and later Persian empires, as is pretty well known. They're fairly widespread in the Roman and Byzantine empires. In China, in Imperial China, from at least the Zhou dynasty in the 11th century BCE, all the way up until the end of the empire in 1911. And of particular interest for future slides, in African kingdoms and empires, perhaps most famously, the eunuch who appears in the biblical book of Acts, the courtier to the queen of what's called Ethiopia, but is really the kingdom of Kush and what's now Sudan, who meets Saint Philip, pictured here, on the road back from Jerusalem. The Ottoman Empire, as you can see from this 18th century miniature, also employed African harem eunuchs. Well, we don't know that the Kushan eunuch was actually a harem eunuch, but he was close to the queen. So this brings me, and before I get to the next slide, let me just say that the Ottoman Empire was not alone among Islamic empires in using eunuchs or in using African eunuchs. That was pretty much the universal practice among Islamic empires, at least from the Abbasids who ruled Baghdad beginning in the 8th century until 1258. And most other Islamic empires, with the exception of the Seljuks of Rome. So this brings us to the question, why Africans? Why were Africans so popular as harem guardians in particular, and why in the Ottoman Empire? Some of these points apply to all Islamic empires and indeed to non-Islamic empires, particularly in Africa itself. Others are specific to the Ottomans. When you see African eunuchs, or indeed any kind of eunuch, they're almost always a part of a much larger population of non-eunuch slaves. And let me just underline the point that with some notable exceptions, most eunuchs throughout the world were slaves. They did not have a choice about whether they were castrated and employed at these imperial courts. So you would expect eunuchs from East Africa to be part of a larger population of East African slaves, and indeed this was the case in the Ottoman Empire. Most East African slaves in Ottoman employ, shall we say, both at the imperial court, at provincial governors' courts, and in wealthy private households were female domestic servants. So the mechanism was already in place to bring those people in, and it was expanded, shall we say, to the eunuchs. A second consideration is the geographical marginality of Eastern Africa in relation to the rest of the Ottoman Empire. The pattern for eunuchs in world history is that they tend to come, they're not native to the place where they're employed, with a couple of notable exceptions, the main one being China under the Qing dynasty, the most recent imperial dynasty. In most empires, including the Byzantine and most Islamic empires, they're brought in from outside, either completely outside the empire's territory or from geographically marginal regions. This is to make sure that the big attraction that seemingly caused all of these empires throughout much of human history to use eunuchs is still available. That is, that they're loyal. This is the big reason that these empires used eunuchs, loyalty to the ruler. And if they can't have children, and if they don't have pre-existing grassroots ties to the location where they're employed, this, at least on paper, means that their sole loyalty would be to the ruler or household head who employs them. So hence the geographical marginality. East Africa was certainly geographically marginal, and I don't mean less than, but on the geographical margins of the Ottoman Empire. They did rule a portion of it, at least temporarily, Habesh Eyaleti, literally the province of Ethiopia, although it was more closer to what's now Eritrea and a bit of Somalia than present-day Ethiopia. It was conquered in the 1550s and under direct Ottoman rule until the late 17th century, give or take. That brings, I'll skip one point before I get to the third point, that brings in the further element of availability. Once the Ottomans had conquered Egypt in 1517, East Africa becomes their neighbor, in essence, a much more available source of eunuchs and other East African slaves than it had previously been. This availability element is a factor in all empires that employ eunuchs or court slaves of any kind. The closer and easier to extract human power from, the more likely a geographical location is to be a source of these slaves. One thing I explored in the book that I haven't really seen explored before where Ottoman eunuchs are concerned are the practices of African kingdoms and empires themselves, like the locales where the eunuchs came from and neighboring locales, such as Ethiopia, the various Sudanese kingdoms, etc. They also, many of them, not all, Ethiopia is a major exception, employed eunuchs at their courts. And they also tended to bring them in from outside their own territories and from marginal regions. peripheral regions of their homes. So, for example, on the rare occasions when the Ethiopian kingdom did make use of eunuchs, they tended to come from the far south of the Ethiopian empire or from this coastal region. So that those are elements, those are points of consideration involved with geography, with availability, with practices in Africa itself. What about the question, and it's pretty hard to ignore, of why African eunuchs tended to be used as harem guardians in Islamic empires, and not exclusively Islamic empires, but it really stands out almost as a trope. You can see it even in the 1001 Nights, which many of the stories of which come from the Abbasid Empire. In addition to availability and all these other geographical considerations, I think a point to keep in mind is that most of the harem women, certainly in the Ottoman Empire, are coming in from outside Ottoman territory themselves, or from outside the Ottoman capital of Istanbul, from the Balkans, from Venice in a few cases, from the Caucasus. In that situation, harem guardians who are from East Africa, from what are now Ethiopia or Nubia or Sudan, are going to be about as culturally and linguistically different as they could possibly be. And that's not even taking the skin color difference into account. And another thing to keep in mind is that the harem guardians didn't actually go into the interior of the harem. They were mainly in the outer passages. So why would you want this? Why would the senior women who dominated the harem want this to be the case? Well, the stereotype is that they wanted to prevent any kind of sexual dalliance, liaison between the harem women and the eunuchs. Now, if they're not actually in the interior of the harem itself, that seems pretty unlikely. But what you also want to prevent is just any kind of threat to the control of the senior women, including the Sultan's mother, his favorite concubine, the various aides and officials that whom the Sultan's mother has around her, all female, by the way. Any threat to the control that they have over the harem. And so having some kind of strategic alliance between a harem guardian and a lower ranking harem woman, whether it's for communication with some official outside the harem, or an economic alliance, or let's talk in the realm of supposition, even a sexual alliance, that is a threat to this control. The reason for the control being that the whole purpose of the palace harem was to reproduce the dynasty, to control sexuality so that the Sultan is provided with the male heir. So as various and sundry have pointed out, it's hardly a den of sin. It's more like a convent where every once in a while one of the residents is selected and has sex with the Sultan with the specific purpose of producing an heir. So in this situation, we're speculating a little bit when we say this, but the cultural difference between these harem women from the Balkans, the Caucasus, et cetera, and these East African eunuchs would have been pretty extreme. They would not have had a common native language. Many of these women had probably never seen an African person before. So all other things being equal, it fits into that system. In the book, I also discussed another element that's hard to ignore, which is racism. Because I think in the use of African harem eunuchs, certainly in the Ottoman case, we are dealing with a kind of racism. And I call it indigenous racism to make it clear that it's not the kind of racism we're depressingly used to in today's world, whether it's in the UK or in the US or in other parts of Europe or wherever it might be. It's not just the kind of color prejudice or racial prejudice that we know depressingly today. That doesn't mean the color prejudice is absent. It's definitely there, but it comes within a kind of mindset, if you want to call it that, where the rulers And the provincial notables in the Ottoman Empire are familiar with a wide spectrum, a broad spectrum of population groups, including within Africa itself. And I say this because if, for example, you look at some of these medieval market regulators manuals, which are available in English translation, as well as in Arabic, you see this bizarre kind of advice for slave buyers in which the various East African and even West African populations are ranked in terms of their desirability. So that the Sub-Saharan Africans are not lumped together as one big mass. In particular, people from the Horn of Africa, what are now Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia, are known as Habeshi, which loosely translates Ethiopian, but encompasses all these populations. And they're regarded as distinct from the so-called Zanj or Zenj, which today is kind of a pejorative term, the larger African population west of the Nile River, which in turn is divided into different populations, Nubian, Sudanese, Takruri, which is kind of a blanket term for West Africans. And in these rather horrific slave dealers manuals, the Ethiopians are described as the most attractive, the most intelligent. You know, if you need somebody to guard your harem, then you want an Ethiopian eunuch because they're the most reliable. If you want someone to keep your account books, then use a Nubian because they're the cleverest. You know, these stereotypes about different populations. So that's one element. But within the Ottoman system itself, there's also a new kind of hierarchy of populations that we can see kind of taking shape in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, in which people from Western Anatolia and the Balkans, the so-called Rumis, are on top. And there's a whole spectrum of populations, including the Habeshis, the other African populations, Arabs of different regions, Albanians, Circassians, etc. And that's part of this indigenous racism as well. So it's a very complicated issue, but I thought I had to discuss it in the book, and it does play a role in why Africans are used as harem guardians. Doesn't solve the problem, present an easy solution to that question, but it is one element to be considered. Before I get off this slide, what about the slave trade routes involved? We are talking about a mainly East African slave trade. And you can see the major routes are land caravan routes going up through the Sudan, from the Horn of Africa and Ethiopia, through the Sudan into Egypt. There's also this Red Sea route, and it seems that most young boys, they're usually prepubescent, who are going to be castrated are taken along this sea route, possibly because it's less arduous than the land route and doesn't take as long, at least initially. They're often taken to Mecca and Medina, or at least to Jeddah, the port of Mecca, and then back across to Egypt. That may sound kind of circuitous, but apparently it was more efficient than months on this overland caravan. And of course, speaking of waiting until the dolmush is full, these caravans would not leave until they had their full complement of slaves, goods, ivory, et cetera, et cetera. And they departed at certain times in the year. For where the castration took place, you know, this is the kind of question that audiences always want to know. It seems to have been mainly in Upper or Middle Egypt, and by the Ottoman period, certainly the 18th century, the main place where it was done was in or near the Egyptian town of Asyut, in particular, a Coptic monastery, a monastery run by Coptic monks. And it was the monks, apparently, who carried out this highly systematized castration. That's another point. Islamic law forbids castration. So that's a pretty big obstacle to get around. And having Christian practitioners carry out the operation on the margins, again, of Ottoman territory was one way to, if not completely circumvent the obstacle, at least to blur it, to fudge things a little bit. Much has been said about the nature of castration, of the castration that Ottoman eunuchs underwent. Apparently, in most, if not all, Islamic empires, all eunuchs, whether they were African or not, were radically castrated, meaning the entire genitalia were removed with one cut in an operation that was described as early as the 10th century Common Era by an Arab traveler. This has received a great deal of comment. I'll just say that in the era before antibiotics, you can imagine that the death rate was quite high, and it's impossible to get reliable statistics on this. Late 18th century European observers claimed that it was extremely low, around 2%. Evliya Çelebi, the famous 17th traveler, claims that it was quite high as 60%. The big factor here appears to be how practiced the castrators were, what time of year they performed the operation in. If it were summer, you could expect more bacteria, therefore more infection. And death was mainly from infection, not from blood loss. Infection of the urethra in particular. And how sanitary the surroundings were. And apparently the monastery near Asyut was one of the cleaner, more efficient operations. I'm sure there'll be questions about that, but we can get to them later on. Okay, so that's background. What about the creation of the office of chief eunuch? There was always a head, like a eunuch head honcho among the eunuchs who guarded the Ottoman harem. And here I'm talking really about the period after the Ottoman court moved to Topkapı Palace in Istanbul. So after Istanbul is conquered and after Topkapı is built. And the critical period is the late 18th century, when the official office of chief of the harem eunuchs in Ottoman Turkish, Darüssaade, or Aga of the Abode of Felicity, which is the euphemism for the harem, was created. It has everything to do with the way Topkapı is laid out and with the actions of one particular late 16th century Sultan, namely Murad III, whom you see in this illustration down here. So this is a kind of miniature plan of Topkapı that's it's near the ticket office as you come out, really. Topkapı is laid out horizontally, so today what's more or less the parking lot goes through this gate into the second court, which is semi-public. And then you have the Babusade, the Gate of Felicity, which separates the Sultan's private court, the third court, from the semi-public court. And right behind the Babusade is the Sultan's audience chamber. So before Murad III, most sultans who lived in Topkapı had spent most of their time when they were there, when they weren't out on campaign or whatever, in this third court, and specifically in the privy chamber, which is right next to what became the harem. And so the eunuchs they saw the most of were the eunuchs, the white eunuchs, so to say, the ones from the Balkans and Caucasus, who populated the third court. These were like palace page eunuchs. Their duty was to protect the Sultan himself, to guard his privacy, if you want. Murad, however, more or less moved into the harem. That is, he started spending all his free time when he was in the palace in the harem and not in the privy chamber in the third court. Okay, so it's during his reign that the harem really becomes this enormous kind of a city on the western side of the palace. If you've taken a tour of the Topkapı harem, you know that you actually go in at this entrance off the second court, and it just extends back, running parallel all the way through the third court. It's like its own court. It's not really part of the second or third. It expands dramatically because Murad is living there, and he has to have his bedroom and a bath and someplace to pray and rooms for all his many staff members. But now they have to be female staff members because he can't take his male staff in there. What this does, first of all, is it really cements this growing dichotomy within the palace eunuch population between the third court or gate of felicity eunuchs, these white eunuchs from the Balkans and Caucasus on the one hand, and the harem eunuchs, the abode of felicity eunuchs from Eastern Africa on the other. And you can see that by Murad's reign, the African eunuchs outnumber the third court or white eunuchs from about 10 to 1. What does that have to do with the creation of the office of chief harem eunuch? Well, believe it or not, in addition to having something to do with the sheer importance of the harem eunuchs, it also has to do with something that might at first seem completely extraneous to the palace. And this is the pious foundations that support the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. This is a kind of Muslim charitable foundation known as in Turkish as a vakuf. And so in Ottoman Turkish, these foundations are known as Evkaful Haramain, the vakufs for the two holy cities, the two harems from the same root as harem, meaning that they're kind of taboo or sacred spaces. So the idea is, just a little digression on the Evkaf, to support the poor of the holy cities and to support the transport of grain, which cannot grow in the Arabian Peninsula, to the holy cities, and to provide things like wells, water wells, hostels, soup kitchens, even madrasas, that is Islamic seminaries and Quran schools for the population of Mecca and Medina and for the pilgrims to Mecca every year. Land and properties all over the empire are endowed to these huge foundations founded by the Sultan and the imperial women over the centuries. The idea is that the revenues from the lands, from growing crops on these lands, or from the rents on shops that are specifically endowed, will go to Mecca and Medina. You might think, what does this have to do with the palace? Well, you can see these as imperial family foundations or imperial household foundations. So it's not the Ottoman state per se, it's the Sultan and the imperial women who have founded these. So the head of the Sultan's household, that is the proper person to oversee these pious foundations. And before Murad III, the official head of his household was the chief of the white eunuchs. The chief eunuch of the Gate of Felicity. But what Murad did in the 1580s, and an exact year is a little bit hard to pin down, was to transfer the supervision to the head of the harem eunuchs. And it's with this transfer that the head of the harem eunuchs receives the title Agha-i Darzadeh, or chief harem eunuch. And what it means is that his economic power ramps up dramatically because he is in charge of making sure that these revenues from all the Ottoman provinces make their way to Mecca and Medina every year. So that means he has connections throughout the empire. And probably when this particular head of the harem eunuchs was named supervisor, it was in recognition of pre-existing connections that he had. So the first chief harem eunuch, the first head of the harem eunuchs to hold this position was Habeshi Mehmed Aga from Ethiopia. And there's an origin mythology that claims that he really was Amharic from what is now Ethiopia. But he's pictured here in this illustration. Here's Murad, and here is Habeshi Mehmed sitting to his right, a diminutive pale blue figure. So that's the creation. It's no coincidence, I don't think, that the office was created under Murad, who moved into the harem because he was around harem eunuchs much more of the time, and they became much more influential during his reign. Also not a coincidence, I don't think, that the office emerges right as the Ottoman Empire is going into this global crisis, which really explodes, shall we say, at the beginning of the 17th century. As many of you probably know, it is global, it's multifaceted, it's climatic, economic, demographic. It's also dynastic where the Ottomans are concerned. And in that case, It means that after these incredibly lengthy sultanic reigns, like Suleiman I, who reigns for over 40 years, Murad himself, who reigns for 21, you suddenly have these sultans who come to the throne as teenagers, as 20-somethings, and then die of disease, or in the case of Osman II, are executed, leaving behind either no heirs or only tiny children. In that situation, the harem, dominated by the Sultan's mother, is going to become all the more important, because if the Sultan is a child or an inexperienced adolescent, his mother is really going to have a huge role in the running of the empire, de facto. And the chief eunuch, in most cases, is her ally in this endeavor. So in the early 17th century, really from the 1590s, well into the 17th century, you see competing harem factions that will be headed, let's say, one by the Sultan's mother, another a rival faction by his favorite concubine, and the chief eunuch of the time might be the ally of one or the other. This is also a period when you really start to see a pronounced competition between the harem eunuchs and the white eunuchs of the third court. They're both factions, both populations are competing for the Sultan's presence and attention. The big example I'm going to use is, for my money, the most powerful chief eunuch in Ottoman history, Haja Mustafa Aga. Haja, of course, means that he made the pilgrimage to Mecca at least once. He was essentially the chief eunuch for the entire reign of Sultan Ahmed I in the early years of the 17th century. Then his enemies managed to get him exiled to Egypt, but he came back after poor Sultan Osman II was executed right at the beginning of Murad IV's reign, and served for another year or so until he died in office. When Ahmed I was Sultan, Mustafa was the ally of Ahmed's mother. When Osman II, whom you see pictured here at his enthronement, was Sultan, Osman was murdered by palace soldiers who opposed his reforms. I won't go into the reforms in any great detail, but they were largely military reforms that threatened the soldiers' interests. Mustafa Aga supported these reforms, even though for part of Osman's reign, he was exiled to Egypt. And what you can really see when Haja Mustafa is chief eunuch is growing antagonism toward him by the white eunuchs of the third court, because he completely threatens their authority, the authority of the third court and the privy chamber. And there's one illustration that I think just graphically captures it. It's a Turkish translation and edition of the Persian epic, the Shahnameh, but it's kind of custom designed to fit the characters in the Ottoman court at the time. So they're kind of used as labels for the various medieval Persian epic characters. This double spread of Osman's enthronement really captures that eunuch dichotomy. So you see Osman in the throne, and his throne is on the harem side of this picture. This is the harem side, this is the third court side. Mustafa Aga is here, and he's always painted the same way. He's always this kind of slender, pale gray figure with his hands clasped. Notice he's closer to the Sultan than anyone else in the picture. And in these kinds of two-dimensional book illustrations, your status is determined by how high up you are on the picture frame. He is just a micron lower than the three non-eunuch privy chamber officials, the weapons bearer or silatar, and the two others. He's definitely higher than the chief white eunuch. He's also accompanied by his assistant, who's always the same, he's always a more portly, darker skinned person, always carrying a tesbih, like a Muslim wari beads, and in this case, holding a copy of the book, the Turkish Shahnameh, the Shehname Turki, that he's going to present to the Sultan. We can also see the rank and file of both the harem and the third court eunuchs. For whatever reason, the third court eunuchs extend a little bit higher up on the page, but they're fewer and they're more undifferentiated, whereas the harem eunuchs as tiny as they are, it almost looks as if the artist has tried to differentiate them. So you really get the sense of two warring camps, and that is borne out by chronicles of the time and later. If you're dealing with two harem factions, for example, even the third court eunuchs who are not part of the harem would take sides in this kind of equation. I want to say something about the chief harem eunuch's connections to Mecca and Medina, which I pretty much have to say something about because the Abqaf Haramain are such an important component of the chief harem eunuch's authority. As we've seen with the example of Haji Mustafa Aga, the chief harem eunuch did occasionally himself go on the pilgrimage to Mecca, which the Sultan never did. The imperial women occasionally did, and the chief eunuch, sometimes before he was chief eunuch, sometimes in office. And the example I want to use here is a chief harem eunuch who is immensely important, but is often overlooked in conventional accounts of the harem. He's my personal favorite, Yusuf Aga, who served under Sultan Mehmed IV in the late 17th century. What's so interesting about him is that he's actually deposed from office when Mehmed IV is overthrown in a military coup. And because most chief harem eunuchs, when they were deposed, if they did not die in office, they would be deposed and then they would move to Cairo. It would be kind of an exile, but it was also kind of a retirement. They originated in Egypt, they ended up going back there, and they would have prepared for this the same way you prepare for retirement. They would have had their agents purchase a house in a particular neighborhood of Cairo. They would have acquired slaves, maybe even eunuchs of their own. So it would all be ready for them when they were exiled. And that's what Yusuf was expecting to happen. So he starts out to Egypt. He goes overland for the first leg, but when he's in Western Anatolia, a new group of rebels comes along and they say, you know, you have to go back to Istanbul and be imprisoned while we inventory your property, because the new Sultan, Suleiman II, does not want you to be in power at all. You know, he doesn't want you just to go to Egypt as if nothing had happened. So he goes back, they inventory his property. Meanwhile, the new Sultan tells his governor of Egypt, the new governor, confiscate all of Yusuf Aga's property in Cairo. So by the time Yusuf finally is allowed to go to Cairo to continue, he's broke. I mean, he doesn't have property in there. It's all been confiscated and sold. Doesn't have his slaves. One of his former Mamluks, former non-eunuch elite slaves, manages to buy his house back. And so he kind of lives in impoverished ignominy for 4 years until the new Sultan, after Suleiman II, Ahmed II, pardons him. Let me just get to this structure on the left before I get to his stay in Medina. While he was eunuch, in other words, before he actually went to live in Cairo, he commissioned the structure, now quite dilapidated. It's a structure that will become the most commonly endowed chief eunuch-sponsored structure in Egypt, and it's known as a Sabil Mekteb in Ottoman Turkish. And what it is, yes, that does mean fountain school. The two-story structure on the bottom is what we're calling a fountain, meaning not a fountain that spurts up from the ground, but a little enclosed space where employees dip up cups of water from a reservoir or a cistern and hand it out for free to passersby. It's a pious act. And above that, on the second floor, is a Quran school, usually for orphan boys. This is a structure that seems to be unique to Egypt. It goes back to the late Mamluk Sultanate, and it may have originated in Egypt because you can see this is an open loggia. And climatically, something like this wouldn't really work in Anatolia or in the Balkans. You can see this particular specimen is pretty dilapidated now, but to support all this, the wakala, it's kind of like a han, a caravanserai, commercial warehouse, cum shopping mall, right behind it would have provided the revenue for this. And this particular specimen is kind of crumbling away a little bit south of Bab Zuwayla, the old Fatimid gate in Cairo. Okay, so that's what he does when he is acting chief eunuch. After he's exiled, you know, he lives in this impoverished state for 4 years, and then Sultan Ahmed II in 1691 pardons him. And he appoints him to be head of the eunuchs who guard the Prophet's tomb in Medina. So he spends roughly 5 years in this position. The position is known in Arabic as Sheikh al-Haram. That's, again, the Haram, the taboo or holy space. And you might think, what are eunuchs doing guarding the Prophet's tomb? This is actually an institution that, believe it or not, is still around, although there are only a few eunuchs left and they're very old. But it was founded in probably the late 12th century. I'll try not to dwell on why it has to do with the Mamluk Sultan, the Ayyubids and the Mamluk Sultanate trying to build up the Sunni identity of Medina, which at the time was majority Shiite, not the kind of Shiites that you find in Iran, but mainly Zaydi and Ismaili Shiite. So there was this eunuch guard to keep troublemakers away from the Prophet's tomb. So this was the office that Yusuf acquired in 1691. It was like his return to respectability because he got to live in a mansion at the head of this whole eunuch quarter in Medina, east of the tomb. And he set something of a precedent. He was the first former chief eunuch to have been made head of the tomb eunuchs. So it's an innovation. A century later, it would become the norm. By the late 18th century, a former chief eunuch would go to Cairo and then spend a few years there, then go to Medina. You could pretty much count on it. By the way, what is the connection of Egypt to Medina? Egypt supplied the grain for the holy cities. There were particular villages, mainly in Upper Egypt, that produced nothing but grain, mainly wheat and barley, that would be sent with the Hajj caravan to Mecca and Medina every year. It was one of the most important properties endowed to the Awqaf al-Haramain. I want to say just a little bit more about the chief eunuch and economic infrastructure, mainly to stress the point that his economic intervention was not limited to Egypt and the holy cities or to the Arab provinces. And the example I'm going to use here is what I would call the second most powerful chief eunuch in Ottoman history, Hajı Beşir Aga, the longest serving in the early 18th century. And I'm focusing here on his operations on the Danube. Just I'll throw out that he founded a madrasa, an Islamic seminary in the town of Shvishtov. My mouth's getting a little dry, it's hard for me to pronounce it, which the Ottomans, mercifully for my dry mouth, called Sistova, on the Danube in what is now northern Bulgaria, right on the border with Romania. No trace of the madrasa survives because Shvishtov is where the Russians came ashore during the Second Ottoman-Russo War in the late 18th century. But I really want to focus in on this Danube Delta region. It's today the border region between Romania and Ukraine. And you can really see Hajı Beşir not only founding new of economic infrastructure, but shoring up infrastructure previously founded by one earlier chief harem eunuch in particular. So what about that earlier chief harem eunuch? It was actually the first chief eunuch, Habeshi Mehmed, who really founded the town that is now Ismail in the Ukraine. It was originally called Ismail Geçidi, like Ismail's Crossing. And he founded it. It was his personal foundation within the larger context of the Holy Cities foundations, because every time the chief eunuch founded one of these personal foundations, the line between his personal foundation and the Mecca and Medina imperial pious foundations was extremely blurry. I can say more about that in the Q&A if you're interested. So this town of Habeshi Mehmed's contained all kinds of things, religious structures, warehouses for grain. And what Bashir Aga did 150 years later was to intervene in Habeshi Mehmed's Vakuf, which he could do as chief harem eunuch, and add structures to it, in particular grain warehouses, and also a pachahane. This seems to be like a constant with him in this area. That means a shop that sold sheep trotters, and a bozahane, a shop for boza, the mildly alcoholic beverage made from wheat and or chickpeas. So this is to facilitate grain shipment and garrisoning, protecting the town, because the bozahane and the pachahane are almost certainly for soldiers. He built the same kind of complex in nearby Kilia. These towns are both now in Ukraine. Same kind of thing, 32 grain warehouses, another trotter shop, another boza shop. So you can see he wants to protect grain shipment. This is one of the Ottoman Empire's bread baskets in addition to Egypt. And they want to make sure that the grain gets from the Danube through the Black Sea to Istanbul and anywhere else it needs to go without interference from the Russians, who are becoming more and more of a problem by the 18th century. Back when Habeshi Mehmed was chief eunuch, they were just starting to flex their muscles in the region. By Bashir Aga's time, they're a major threat. And finally, the pièce de résistance. He actually founds a lighthouse in the town of Sulina, Romania, which is right, as you see here, right where the Danube meets the Black Sea. It's this whole delta region. And until about 1900, any ship coming into Romania had to stop at Sulina. Nowadays, they all bypass it and go straight on to nearby Tulcea instead. One of his endowment deeds explains why he founded this lighthouse. It says, because the Sune Strait, that's what the Ottomans called Sulina, Sune is dark and dangerous, and the threat of shipwreck is omnipresent. We founded this lighthouse so that ships can pass in safety. There is still a lighthouse there. Unfortunately, it's not Bashir's lighthouse. It's a later 19th century European Commission replacement, constructed when Romania was already a nation state in the late 19th century. And this is pretty much what it looks like today. This is a tiny, tiny town. Well, today, only about 5 streets, but the town actually goes all the way out. This is the beach, like the swimming area that you see, that little square there. Having mentioned the madrasa at Spishtov, I want to say a few words about the chief eunuch's broader influence on religious and intellectual life. And again, I'm going to use Haji Bashir Aga as the chief example. His most noticeable religious complex, and it doesn't have to be just brick and mortar that is the vehicle for this religious and intellectual influence. It's also books and pious foundations that support Muslim education. All of these things come together in this mosque complex in Istanbul, which you see there on the left. It is located very near Topkapı. In fact, it's right near what is now the Gulhane tramway stop. Like if you're standing there facing the court building, the old court building, it's up this little street to the right to the right of the court. It's what's now called a kuliye, meaning it contained a mosque, and you see the windows of the mosque here. A little sabil, not with a school attached, but just a place to get drinking water. A Quran school, a madrasa, a little lodge for Naqshbandi Sufis, and a library. The library, or book depot, you could say, a storage place for books, is right off the mosque. This is the carpet on the mosque. The mihrab would be over here. And if you're facing the mihrab, to your right is the book storehouse door, with over the door is a plate that says Fiha Kutub. There are books inside in Arabic, which is a common phrase. This collection, which totaled about 1,000 volumes that was inventoried in the late 19th century, formed the core of the current Suleymaniye Library's Bashir Aga collection. He also had a school for Quranic traditions at Ayub, near the Great Cemetery, and that formed the core of Suleymaniye's Bashir Aga Ayub collection. So that's kind of everything rolled into one. He himself also founded a Sabil Mekteb in Cairo. This was before he became chief eunuch. He was actually exiled to Egypt briefly from about 1716 to 17. And right as he was named chief eunuch, he left behind a Mamluk to build the Sabil Kutab. It's right across from a madrasa founded later by Sultan Mahmud I. So you see the Sabil here, Kutab upstairs. The windows have been glassed in. That is my own photograph, but the building was unfortunately locked when I photographed it. Speaking of libraries, the early 18th century is library building time for many imperial officials, grand viziers, sultans, et al. And very famously, Sultan Ahmed III, who was one of the sultans, the other being Mahmud I, whom Bashir Aga served, very famously founded a library on the Topkapi Palace grounds, which an arrow is supposed to point to it when I click, but nonetheless, this is it here. Today, it's staff headquarters, it's offices for palace staff. It is thought by some that Bashir Aga, whom you see pictured here right at the front of the picture frame, that the idea for the library was his, although I have to say no primary sources really support that. But nonetheless, in this particular picture, which is from a festival book that Bashir Aga himself commissioned to commemorate the circumcision of Ahmed III's 4 sons, the library is shown in a prominent place, left of center, right near the Sultan's audience chamber. And in this particular picture, which is the illustration for the cover of the book, you see, again, Bashir Aga at the front with 3 of the 4 princes. The 4th one was only 2 years old, too young to participate in the festivities. And there's a vizier on either side of the princes holding their arms as they proceed through the 3rd court to the circumcision room at the end of all these festivities. So Bashir Aga is really the most important person in this picture. He's in front of the Grand Vizier, whom you see here. He's leading the princes whose education he has overseen when they were small children in the harem. And he's right on kind of a vector with the audience chamber and the library that he supposedly dreamed up. This book, as I said, it's the festival book, the Surname of Vehbi. Vehbi was the poet who composed the text. And in the text, Bashir Aga does not occupy such a central role. The text description of this particular scene has the Grand Vizier leading the procession and the chief eunuch, who is not named, just being back there with the princes. But in the picture, drawn by or painted by the artist Levny, and in other pictures in this same book, Bashir Aga occupies this front and center position. So it's as if I think he had a connection with the painter. It's thought that he actually directed the palace atelier that illustrated this work. And that's why Levny gave him this prominent role in the illustrations that he does not occupy in the text. Okay, my screen is freezing again, which may be my sign that I should start wrapping it up, which I would do if I could get it. To advance.
You're doing fine for time. Please don't truncate your fascinating address because of time.
Okay, I'm just trying to. Thank you. I'm just trying to get the screen to advance. It's frozen, and I can't escape. I'm like pressing page up and page down and nothing's happening. Okay, wait, there we go, all right. Yes, you just keep pounding on the keyboard and eventually something will happen. Bashir Aga, as powerful as he was and as long-lived as he was, seems to be kind of an unintentionally negative watershed because in in the latter part of his tenure in office, he seems to have been more or less choosing the grand viziers and deposing them at will. He had an enormous amount of influence under Sultan Mahmud I. And so after his death, it seems that later grand viziers really tried to curtail the influence of the chief harem eunuch. And so you see this competition in the later 18th century between a series of ambitious grand viziers, most notably Raghib Mehmed Pasha, and a series of equally ambitious, but maybe not as clever as Haji Bashir Aga chief eunuchs. So this kind of sets the stage for what occurs in the 19th century, which is really the denouement of the chief eunuch institution. The Grand Vizier acquires more and more authority, really at the expense of the chief eunuch and other officials, Ottoman officials, particularly those that have a kind of unclear, uninstitutionalized mandate. I mean, the chief harem eunuch is head of the harem, but all these other duties that he performs and all the other perquisites that he acquires are not really a set in stone institution. What we're seeing with the dawn of the 19th century, that makes it sound too periodized, but what we see as we go into the 19th century is an institutionalization of the Ottoman government. Again, part of a global trend really that comes at the expense of officials like the chief harem eunuch, whose duties are not quite as institutionally defined. This culminates, this trend reaches its culmination with the institution of the westernizing reforms known as the Tanzimat. That's when institutionalization on the European model really is fully embraced, and the chief eunuch's office really shrinks. Even before the Tanzimat officially starts, the official start date, I guess you could say, is 1839, under Mahmud II, the Sultan institutes a ministry of Evkaf. So in other words, a whole government ministry to deal with major imperial pious foundations, chief among them, the pious foundations for Mecca and Medina. So supervision of them is taken away from the chief eunuch and given to an ordinary government minister, a pasha. This means, this really cuts off, and that's a horrible pun, which I didn't intend to make, but this really curtails the chief eunuch's influence. His empire-wide network of connections is no longer necessary, and he's really come full circle at this point. He's now limited to the palace, as he was back before Murad III moved into the harem way back in 1574. So it's that institutionalization and the radical change in the administration of imperial pious foundations that is really responsible for the diminution of his status. But also, Topkapi Palace is no longer the main palace of the Ottoman sultans in the 19th century. Instead, they move into a series of European-style palaces on the Bosphorus or near the Bosphorus, north of the old city of Istanbul, Dolmabahce, Turan, and Yildiz Palace. And you can see they don't look very much like Topkapi. They're not horizontally spread out. And I argue in the book that the spatial arrangement of these new palaces, the fact that the harem is not located in relation to the sultan's part of the palace, as it were, the way that it was in Topkapi, this contributes to the diminution of the chief eunuch's power, because in Dolmabahce, for example, the harem entrance is completely separate and separated by a wide courtyard from the entrance to the sultan's various apartments, dining halls, et cetera, et cetera. So the spatial arrangement of these new palaces either reflected the diminution, say it's a feedback loop, it reflects the diminution of his power, it also contributes to it. Which brings us to the end of the empire. By the time Abdulhamid II, who's not the last Ottoman Sultan, but one of the last, he dies in 1909 after being deposed. By the time he's an old man, there is ostensibly still an official called Chief Harem Eunuch, but it's not completely clear what his exact title is. He's not always called Aga-i Darusade. He's sometimes just called Kızlar Ağası or Aga of the Girls. And he almost doesn't seem to be that important and official. In particular, there are other palace eunuchs, so-called companions, the word in Ottoman Turkish is musahib, whose importance is equally great, who are maybe closer to the Sultan. And as an example of this, I'm going to give perhaps the most famous late and post-Ottoman eunuch, a man named Nadir Ağa, who was never chief harem eunuch. He wasn't even first companion. He became Abdülhamid's second companion right before Abdülhamid was deposed, so as a teenager. And you see him here in this is the post-Tanzimat eunuch costume, kind of like the Sultan, the basic palace official costume, as a kind of variation on European dress uniform with medals and so on. Nadir Aga survived the collapse of the empire, not only the coup that brought down Abdülhamid and the Young Turk coup and Abdülhamid's attempted counter coup, but the collapse of the empire, and died in 1957. So I deal a little bit in the book with what happens to these harem eunuchs after the empire collapses. In contrast to the harem women, the Young Turk government kind of collects them in Topkapı Palace, the old palace, and meanwhile they've sent telegrams to their families, most of whom at the time were in Circassia, or they had left Circassia because of Russian encroachment and fled to Ottoman Anatolia. And they basically send telegrams saying, come get your daughters, even if the daughter has been in the harem for decades and is now a middle-aged woman. So at least some of these women had their birth families come and get them. This was not the case for the harem eunuchs because for the most part, these African eunuchs did not retain any kind of contact with their families for reasons that are not entirely clear, but that seem to have a lot to do with the kind of mass scale and impersonal, kind of brutal impersonal nature of the East African slave trade. Nadir Aga stands out, or at least trying to get in touch with his birth family in Ethiopia. He was actually from Ethiopia, from the Oromo region, and he was a Muslim by birth, but he was still enslaved by these slave raiders who didn't care, apparently. So with Abdülhamid's help, he tries to get in touch with his family. Abdülhamid actually wrote to the Emperor of Ethiopia with this question. The emperor at that time was doing his best to avoid being overthrown and also being invaded by Italy. This is way before Mussolini. This is in the early years of the 20th century. So he sends some agents out to Nadir Aga's birth village, and they find out that his mother and sister have fled to Kenya because of all the unrest in Ethiopia. So Nadir Aga gets this letter that says, unfortunately, we were unable to find your family, but here is an elephant tusk from an elephant that we hunted down near your village of origin. So he had to be, along with the Order of the Lion from the Ethiopian emperor. So he had to be satisfied with that. Former palace eunuchs seem to have tried to keep a low profile if they stayed in Istanbul. A number of them moved to the Asian side, which early in the 20th century was pretty much undeveloped agricultural land. There are reports of a kind of ex-eunuchs mutual aid society to which Nadir belonged, which met every once in a while through at least the 1930s. And Nadir himself moved into a house in Göztepe on the shore of the Sea of Marmara. He bought a herd of Crimean dairy cows and he opened a dairy. And he claims to have been the first person in Istanbul to have delivered milk in bottles. We know this because right at the end of his life in the 1950s, he gave an interview to a prominent Turkish magazine. And then much later, the lady who lived next door to him, her son wrote an article for Tarife Toplum magazine. So this was apparently the kind of experience of ex-harem eunuchs. You were instantly recognizable as a harem eunuch because you were obviously from Eastern Africa, and eunuchs look a certain way because of the hormonal deficiencies, a kind of broad cheekbones, lack of facial hair. Nader was very tall and thin. What about the tomb eunuchs in Medina? This will be my last point, I think. I mentioned right at the beginning of the talk that the tomb eunuch institution sort of still exists. I thought, sure, when I started researching the chief harem eunuch long ago, that the Saudis would have abolished this institution because they're Wahhabis, and this is obviously an innovation to the practice of the Prophet Muhammad and the original Muslim community. It's a 12th century innovation. And yet, when it took over Mecca and Medina in the early 20th century, not only did they not pension off the existing tomb eunuchs, but they kept the institution going. Slavery was outlawed in Saudi Arabia only in 1962, so apparently they kept acquiring East African and maybe a few Indian boys, prepubescent boys, and having them castrated. So that now, I think at this point, there are maybe 3 or 4 maximum of these men left, and they're all old men. There was a photo exhibit. The art historian Unver Rustem at Johns Hopkins tipped me off to it. It was in 2012 at Latham House in London, and it's called The Guardians. The Saudi photographer was allowed to photograph these remaining surviving tomb eunuchs, and he just created an exhibit of these photos. It's very respectfully done. And he actually said these men kind of exude this aura of sanctity. They came in for their photos. They said virtually nothing. They're sophisticated men. This one over here, who I think was the equivalent of the chief, had just gotten back from Texas, where he was visiting his relatives. He had a niece who was going to medical school in Texas or something like that. So you don't really think of a tomb eunuch as jetting to Texas to visit his medical student niece, but there it is. Tomb eunuchs enter the modern world. You can't make this stuff up. I think I will stop there because I've been going for over an hour. It all ends with the tomb. So I can't say enjoy this photo of tombs and graves, but this is kind of where they end up. So yes, I am done, and I guess we now proceed to questions and answers.
Yes, thank you so much. That really was absolutely marvelous. Really, a lifetime's study. Every single sentence had a carefully chosen. I won't say fact because that sounds like it trivializes it, but every single sentence had a carefully contextualized piece of information that helped us piece together the wider picture. So thank you for that absolute masterpiece of a presentation, a lesson to us all. I'm sure many people have questions, and please do think of yours. One thing I've always found fascinating is this wonderful patchwork of checks and balances between the Sultan and the pure, if you want, power of the Orthodox religious authorities. And I mean, and clearly the relationship between the eunuchs and religion would be one that would be potentially very, very interesting. And I was struck by the fact that you indicated, if I understand correctly, that some form of heterodox Islam was responsible for looking after at least some of the foundations. I'd be very interested if you could expand on that a bit. And because if we've got it's very, very interesting to think of a sultan who wants to have power, but of course has to some extent subordinate themselves to religion. And so on the one side, they've got the janissaries with their highly unorthodox Bektashi credentials. On the other side, they have the eunuchs. I mean, I don't know how religion fits into this overall tapestry, and I'd be very interested to hear what you think about that.
And when you mention heterodoxy, you're not referring to the Shiite population of Medina before the tomb eunuchs, before that institution was founded. You mean like the Bektashis and so on?
Yeah, indeed. Yes.
Okay, we all wonder how to square the Bektashis, the seemingly heterodox or heterodox leaning Sufi order that was so close to the Janissaries, with the very orthodox Sunnism that the Ottomans practiced. I will say the Ottomans, it's hard to say anything general about their religious mindset. They did revere the Ahlul Bayt, the family of the Prophet Muhammad, and inasmuch as Bektashiism also reveres the Ahlul Bayt, including Ali, Hassan, Hussein, etc., they have that in common, except, of course, that Orthodox Sunnism, I don't need to tell you, does not consider the 12 Shiite imams to have the kind of religious authority that they have in Shiism. The 12th imam is not believed to be the Mahdi who will return at the end of time, not in Sunnism. So I probably just muddied the issue, but in the book, and again, it sounds like I'm plugging it, it is 3 years old. I'm not working on chief eunuchs anymore, but there is a chapter on religious and intellectual life. And I mentioned that one thing that all these Sabil Mektabs in particular were supposed to achieve was to promote Hanafi education. And I noticed that as you go into the 18th century with Bashir Agha, Haji Bashir Agha, you see a greater emphasis on the specifically Hanafi nature of these institutions. Under Haji Mustafa Agha in the early 17th century, you see at least one foundation of his that caters to both Hanafis and Shafis, which is not exactly outrageous, but Hanafism is the official Ottoman legal right or mezhab. So there is a catering to Sunni orthodoxy. There's also quite a pronounced Sufi patronage of various orders, mainly Naqshbandi and Halveti. Not so much Mevlevi, and certainly not Bektashi.
And we don't know anything about any of the eunuchs' religious orientation. I suppose we just don't have any at that level of detail.
Well, Sufi and Hanafi, I would say, for the most part.
Okay.
And where, the Qadazadali movement is quite famous now in the Ottoman field, this anti-Sufi, what I often call puritanical movement in the 17th century, led mainly by provincial mosque preachers from Anatolia and northern Syria. And where the eunuchs come down on that is an interesting question. Some of them, not a chief eunuch, but one of the senior palace eunuchs in the early 17th century or mid 17th century seems to have been their ally. And certain Qadazadali preachers in the capital, like the leadership of this movement, kind of try to worm their way into the Harem eunuchs' good graces and divide the eunuch population against each other, if you will, to get the senior eunuch on their side against the chief, this kind of thing. So they're in.
Oh, please, sorry.
Yeah, their endowments and the libraries and everything give us a little bit of a clue to their religious orientation.
Yes, that was an excellent point. Oh goodness me, we could carry on discussing these for a long time, but there are questions in the chat. But why don't we, before we go to those, as it were, why don't you feel free to pose your question orally? We can work through the chat ones, of course, but please go ahead. Anybody who would like to ask their question, just unmute yourselves if you can and fire away. Please, Yadna, go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Hathaway. Good to see you.
Hi, Yadna. Nice to see you.
And thank you for inviting me. I was wondering about your use of the term chief harem eunuch in a lot of your work, as opposed to the more commonly used, at least in what I've read in my experience, the term black eunuch, which I've read in a lot of other places.
Yes, I started out, and I haven't really my entire career working on the chief eunuch, although he did pop into my dissertation research. I hadn't been expecting it. But back when I was doing my first book back in the 90s, I did use the term chief black eunuch. And really, I'm American, and I think in the current climate and even in the climate over the past decade, it really made me uncomfortable to use the term chief black eunuch, because my own time, my own context interacting with what I'm studying. It seemed like a label. First of all, it's not what the office was called. It is called Chief Harem Eunuch or Eunuch of the Imperial Threshold. Chroniclers usually refer to this population as harem eunuchs. It's their detractors. You have these chroniclers who have an agenda, and they're often patronized by the third court eunuchs or by enemies of the harem eunuchs. And they go on and on about the blackness of the chief eunuchs, and they make all kinds of horrible puns. And so I just thought, it's a loaded term, and it makes me personally uncomfortable to use it. It sounds, I guess I'm responding to it too much as an American, and someone whose mother came from Tennessee. It sounds too racialized to me. It also doesn't really convey the nuances of what we think we know about the Ottomans' own racial perceptions, which we still know very little about. So you could say, to be safe, but also to be accurate, I decided, call them by the name of the office, harem eunuch, not black eunuch, because there were eunuchs of color who did other things. There were also eunuchs of no color, or it's hard to know what to call the so-called white eunuchs, which I'm not really comfortable with that term either. But if you threshold eunuch, third court eunuch, that's more nebulous than harem eunuch. And then if you say, well, the eunuchs of other origins, including Balkan, Venetian, and from the Caucasus, not to call them Caucasian, that's really a mouthful. So you could say it's political correctness, but it's also accuracy and historical comfort level, I guess I would say. But thank you for the question, because I think it's important, because you can still see black eunuchs, that term being thrown around, just like slave girl. Someone reading one of my manuscript of one of my later publications said, can we stop using slave girl to define concubine? The baggage behind the term slave girl is equally troubling.
Thank you. I was grappling with what terminology to use in my own research, and I was going kind of back and forth between, because your work has been such a major player in my research, but also the other things that I've read, I had not really seen that term. So I assumed, based on reading your other research, that there was legitimate reasoning behind it. So I was curious about that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Another person who would like to say something? Otherwise, we have questions in order here on the chat. So Tina Lundberg would like to ask about the process of conversion, and says, were the East African eunuchs already Muslims, or were they made to convert? And she also asked, as eunuchs, how did they perceive their lives? Because of course they have been castrated.
Right, the second question is much harder to answer. As far as the conversion, the earlier eunuchs were, at least we think for the most part, not Muslim originally. They would have been largely animist, non-monotheistic spiritual religions, seemingly indigenous to the parts of East Africa they came from. Habeshi Mehmed Agha's kind of origin legend, which is written in the margins of a chronicle, claims that he was, in fact, originally Muslim from the Amharic population of Ethiopia, even though the Amharic population is majority Christian. And we've seen that Nader Agha, the very late Ottoman harem eunuch, was originally Muslim, as most Oromo are today. So if they did convert, this would usually be accomplished after castration in Egypt. And the thing was, like many harem women, they went to a kind of lower ranking palace household, like the governor, the household of the governor of Egypt, or later, in the case of Nader Agha, one of the emirs of Mecca. That was their first stop, the first place where they were trained to be a eunuch servant. So I describe this in the book as kind of like a finishing school, which may be a bad analogy, but this is where they converted. They learned the basics of Sunni Islam, learned Arabic and or Turkish, just learned how to behave in a royal household, you know, keep your eyes down and your hands folded in front of you if the Sultan or his mother appears. Speak only when you're spoken to. Here's what you wear. Here's how you keep yourself clean. All that stuff. If you've seen the incredibly famous Turkish soap opera, Magnificent Century, Muhteşem Yüzyıl, that's one of the few things that seems 100% accurate about Harem or Roxolana's enslavement. She mentions, I think it's even in the first episode, that she went first to the palace of the Khan of Crimea before coming to Suleiman's palace, Topkapı. And that's where she converted and learned Turkish and all of that. And it was the same for the harem eunuchs. They would usually, they'd be presented to Topkapı by the governor of Egypt, or particularly in the 18th century by one of the provincial notables. Oh, and how they saw themselves, that's very hard to tell. I say a little bit about this in the book. Nader Aga is really an exception because you don't usually have access to anything approaching a memoir or an interview by these people. When Yusuf Aga, the late 17th century eunuch, is deposed and when his property is all taken away from him, the chronicler Naima, writing decades after the event, claims that it's not Naima, it's Silahtar, also writing decades after the event, claims that he kind of wails when the rebels are taking him to prison. I was the chief harem eunuch. Now I'm only a 10 kurush. He uses the term Arab, but in that context, it means a Black African or a sub-Saharan African. So there's this, that kind of gives you, if it's true, which it may not be, some insight into how he regards this loss of status. Habeshi Mehmed's origin legend, which again may have been composed by someone else without his knowledge, kind of invents this incredibly respectable background for him, that he is Amharic. There's some kind of cachet among Ethiopian populations to being Amharic. And there's something, he's captured in a shipwreck. The idea is he's on a Muslim ship, but it's raided by Frankish pirates. And so it's like Emine Fetbaca, who's an art historian, has suggested that it might be a way to claim that, you know, the fact that he ended up being a eunuch was really a consequence of this act of European piracy. And so it kind of, it whitewashes, you know, to use a poor analogy, poor word choice, the whole act of enslavement and castration by kind of blaming it on the European pirates.
Well, thank you. That's also really extraordinary level of detail in spite of everything. We have another question in the chat, this time from Jill Sindel, and she says, did the influential women in the harem support the chief eunuch when the vizier's power increased in the 19th century? And did the special arrangements in the new Ottoman palaces reflect the diminution of power in the harem?
Well, that's a very good question. As it happens, the 19th century is my big weak spot. And writing that chapter was one of the toughest things because I really felt out of my depth. But I think compared to the Topkapı harem under Murad III and going into the 18th century, it's a much smaller harem overall in these European palaces. There's somewhat more homogeneity in terms of ethno-geographical origin among the women. Most of them are from Circassia, which is now southern Russia, in the Caucasus, to be blunt. My impression is that you don't see the level of political influence of the Sultan's mother and favorite concubines. I mean, they're still important within the palace themselves, but because within the palace itself, but because of this growing institutionalization, I mean, the harem women occupy that kind of non-institutionalized, I don't want to call it soft power, that's too policy wonk terminology, but this kind of non-institutionalized fluid power, the same kind of influence that the chief eunuch occupied. And in this new reality where there's a ministry of Kaf, pious foundations, where the Grand Vizier really is kind of a prime minister equivalent, where there's a kind of secretary of, or minister of, foreign minister equivalent, these informal institutions really are much more limited to the palace. So you still see harem eunuchs who are quite close to the harem women, the Sultan's mother, the sisters, princesses, etc. But they really are more like aides or valets. You know, they don't have this pan-imperial I won't say institutional influence, but this they don't wield that kind of influence with these pan-imperial connections by the 19th century. So they're still influential, and there is mutual support with the harem women, but it's much more limited to the palace sphere, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really, really interesting. Of course, there are parallels in our society. I mean, if you look at the London gentlemen's clubs, they often had separate rooms for women, where the women could be members as spouses of their husbands. And of course, when they went not co-educational, but you know what I mean. When they went so that both people of both sexes could become members, they closed down the separate annexes for women, which meant that women who had sometimes spent decades being involved in the organization of these clubs were suddenly not even allowed to enter them anymore.
Irony of ironies.
Yeah, absolutely. But yet they still, in the Oxford and Cambridge, for example, today, they've still got a room which is called the women's drawing room. But of course, it's not for women anymore. It's just a drawing room. Anyway, Celia Kerslake unfortunately had to go. Says, can you say anything about the education received by the chief harem eunuchs, and how important was their role in supervising the education of the princes? And she says, thank you very much, but I have to go.
Right, I understand. Yeah, the harem eunuch's education, particularly that of the chief eunuch, was very much that of the palace pages. So roughly the same, we think, as the eunuchs of the third court. And much of the libraries that some of these people amassed, and Bashir Aga in particular, reflect at their core this palace pages education. It's very much a Sunni Hanafi education. You learn the Quran, of course, the hadith or sayings of the Prophet, basic Quranic exegesis or tafsir, something about fiqh or Islamic law. Bashir's library and that of earlier harem eunuchs, those of earlier harem eunuchs, also contain works of Sufism, Ottoman poetry, some history, well-known Arabic histories, great medieval works of Hanafi exegesis, medical works. The medical stuff, that's noticeable, and you can speculate as much as you want about, you can say, oh yes, of course a eunuch is going to have medical books because of all the medical problems that early castration before puberty causes, hormonal imbalances, urinary tract infections, et cetera, maybe. We can't know for sure. Works on inheritance also loom pretty large, and that's understandable because, you don't have children to pass your wealth on to, so you really, what they did was to use Vakuf, to use personal pious foundations to channel their wealth that way, but it didn't always work, as Yusuf Aga's experience shows. The state, the treasury could always come in and confiscate whatever wasn't endowed of your estate. Supervising the education of princes. This was something that the chief harem eunuch did. While the princes were prepubescent themselves and lived in the harem, he didn't actually hold classes, but he would appoint the Hoja, usually a Hanafi Quran teacher, who came and oversaw. The princes had a little room right near the chief harem eunuch's suite of apartments at the harem entrance, where they would read the Quran and begin their studies. And then when they were about 18 or possibly younger, once they stopped being, the princes, I mean, once they stopped being sent out to govern provinces in Anatolia to learn how to be sultan, they were raised in the harem. And when they became adults, they'd be given a little, in the best case, they would be given a kind of private apartment at the rear, where they'd have their own eunuch kind of butler life coach combination, not the chief eunuch, but a lower ranking eunuch, to be kind of their aide. So the end of this practice of sending the princes out to the provinces to form little micro palaces out there, and the beginning of the institution whereby the princes were raised in the harem. This gives the harem eunuchs that much more influence in shaping them, as an part of which was educating them.
Thank you. I mean, it's of course it would be a bit tricky if you were a eunuch to a prince who fell out of favor.
Yes, which did happen. And in that case, in the best case, you'd probably go to Cairo, be sent to Cairo. Worst case, exiled to one of the Aegean islands, which was usually a prelude to execution.
There we are. Now, any more questions, please? We've got through our colleagues' comments in the chat. Any more questions from the floor? Anybody would like to mention? Please go ahead.
Maybe the questioner is muted.
Yes, if you would like to unmute yourselves. I don't know whether, Craig, you can unmute anybody who wants to talk, or perhaps our audience is thinking it's about time for dinner in where we are in England. Well, in that case, there is just one comment in the chat. I see. Jill says thank you very much for the answer, or not to our speaker. Well, I think in that case we just have to thank our speaker for really, as I said in my initial comment, an absolute masterpiece, an elucidation of a lifetime of fruitful study.
Wow, I wish I got comments like this all the time. Well, this is really good for my ego.
Not well, and indeed it's been good for our education. So we just a round of applause, please, for our speaker. I can see everybody is muted, but if you're not muted,
thank you very much, and thank you for your patience. And this has really been a wonderful forum, and I'm glad to know about it, and hope I'll get an opportunity to join you for future, as a member of the audience, for future presentations.
Oh, well, of course, we should be honoured. So thank you very much, and good evening from London, and depending on the time of day where you are, many greetings. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, and to Yadna and Laura for showing up.
And thank you, Craig, for organising it.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Craig. Thank you, David.